Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Happiness Journey with Dr. Dan podcast, where every journey is worth living. My name is Dr. Dan, and I'm your host for today's episode. I'm a bilingual neurolinguistic programming and cognitive behavior psychotherapist specializing in anger management issues, both court-appointed and private, marriage and relationship coaching using the emotional focused therapy method, dissociative disorders, narcissistic personality disorders, depression, anxiety, dream analysis, and also provide life, business, and retirement coaching support. I provide individual one-on-one session in both French or English and also do group settings. If you need any assistance, reach out to DMV Therapy and Coaching Services at 301-325-1550, and our website can be found at lifecoachdanamzalak.com. Today, I'm very excited to have for our 7th episode of season 24, a very special guest and therapist specializing in toxic relationships, Shannon Petrovic. And just like every of my past episode, I will leave it up to the guests to properly introduce themselves, as no one can do a better job. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Dan. It seems like you have a ton of things that you're doing that are really benefiting the world, and that's really impressive.
Thank you.
So I've been a therapist for about 36 years, and about 6 years ago, I decided that I really wanted to share the things I've learned with a wider audience, and I started a YouTube channel, Therapist Talks. I added another thing beyond that, Thrive Beyond Narcissism, because it seemed like that was what people wanted to hear most, is how to heal after a narcissistic relationship. So I've specialized in that, and then I wrote a book about healing from narcissistic abuse, which is out of the fog into the clear, journaling to help you heal from toxic relationships. I've also got a coaching program, and I think it all started really, I had a high school boyfriend that was extremely narcissistic and toxic and abusive, and it was very hard to get away from him and to get clear of that and then to heal from it. It really took years. And I had a very terrible therapist in college that really was no help whatsoever. So I think in part that probably helped me want to be a therapist, to try to figure it out and do it better. So it's just been an interesting journey, and I try to help people any way I can.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Shannon, for being here today. And I guess both of our careers are very, very similar in nature, which is helping. And especially after the pandemic, we have seen a lot of people dealing with, mental health challenges that were never addressed before. But because of how we were so isolated, it basically exacerbated their symptoms, which made them to be prompted into going and getting the help of a therapist. So I think you and I were definitely contributing incredibly well to to society in this nature. So I know that a lot of people who are going through relationships nowadays, especially dealing with someone who's narcissistic, can you just let our listeners know about what are the signs, I would say the red flags? Let's say someone now is coming into a new relationship with someone that they met online or wherever. What should they be careful about before really opening their heart to that person?
That's such a good question. It's so important because people jump into relationships much too quickly. And I always recommend people spend a lot of time getting to know a person before they become intimate. Because once you are intimate with somebody, you're actually tricking your brain into being very, very attached to them at the level. So this stuff called oxytocin, I know you know this, but floods your system when you're intimate with somebody, and it's at the level of breastfeeding a baby. So you're attaching yourself to this person you barely know at the level of breastfeeding a baby, and it's just such a dangerous thing to do. I always say, if you don't trust them enough and know them well enough to give them the keys to your car and the PIN number to your bank account, you should not be sleeping with them.
That's so true.
And people always sit back and go, "Oh, so the third date? No?" I'm like, "No." And if someone can't roll with that, then they're all about that and not getting to know the real you. So it's really important that you take the time it takes to get to know somebody on a really deep level, and then that you watch everything, that you literally listen for what do they think is funny, because people who think it's funny to see somebody hurt or in despair or crash and burn, emotionally speaking, they're not healthy. Somebody who is all about themselves, all about their own thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs, and doesn't have any interest in yours, they're not going to be a healthy relationship for you. If you feel like you have to pour in and pour in and pour in and placate and peacekeep and people please, that's not going to be healthy.
I see.
Basically, they're letting you know really early on that they matter, you don't, and you're not going to be able to fully exist in that relationship. And that's the definition of toxic.
Absolutely.
Um, and unfortunately, we have to really start by looking at our own selves and our own relationship within ourselves. And this is one thing that a therapist early in my 20s did get right.
Mhm.
She asked me to write down all the times that I put myself down inside my head.
Yes.
First, it sounded like a really stupid assignment. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm like literally running myself down tens of thousands of times a day.
I
So
see.
when you're doing that to yourself, you cannot be in a healthy relationship, because anytime somebody runs you down, it sort of resonates with what you're already saying about yourself. So you're not going to stand up for yourself.
Absolutely.
And they, again, matter and you don't, more and more over time. So it's really important you fix that first. In my book and in my coaching, I always go into the relationship with yourself first. If that's toxic, then that's the place to start. You also want to notice if they are kind and caring and empathic towards others and towards animals, towards, a lot of people say, if my dog doesn't like him, forget it. I'm like,
That's so.
hallelujah, that works.
But then again, when you look at just like when you look at autism, there's different spectrum of autism. There's different spectrum of narcissistic behavior, such as vulnerable narcissism, malignant narcissism, covert narcissistic. So, how much weight do you put in each? Can someone be narcissistic in nature but still show empathy?
Yes, and that's so unfortunately, people don't fit in their boxes and stay there. So we're talking about narcissistic traits
Mhm.
and sometimes full-blown disorder, but a lot of times people have a lot of narcissistic traits, so they're not going to be healthy in a relationship, but it isn't like they're full-blown narcissistic personality disorder
Okay.
or malignant narcissist. The covert stuff is really tough because they hide really well
Mhm.
and they can act very caring, very concerned, very empathic, but you can see it in their daily actions. And that's why it takes time. You have to know, what does a person act like and look like when they're sad or when they're disappointed or when they don't get their way or when you have other plans? Are they throwing little microaggressions out at you because you said no or not today or I'm busy this week or whatever? Do they pout? Do they, throw a little tantrum? Do they say, give you a guilt trip like, well, I guess you don't care about me as much as I care about you, like all this other garbage. It's really childish. And if you step back and watch, you can recognize, wow, that was really childish.
Mhm.
And they're saying to me that if I have something to do that's not important, that they are important. And if I don't completely attend to them, then they're going to have a little meltdown. So they can implode or explode. Coverts tend to implode, and
Yeah.
that can be just as toxic and more confusing. Pia Melody called it attacking from victim.
Mhm.
And so that's that martyr narcissist who really flips things around all the time, or even projects onto you and says, well, you're so uncaring and unempathic that you won't do this or that for me.
I see.
And then you feel like, well, no, I'm really caring and empathic person, so I guess I have to do this or that for you. So
Mhm.
it all kind of trains you to park into your box and do what they want. So it's a manipulation, it's a control game, ultimately, and it makes you sick. Over time,
Yes.
you will become physically and emotionally sick and drained.
Mhm.
And I have people in my practice who will come in and say, I have terrible anxiety and depression, and they have no idea that that's coming from the relationship they're living in.
That's
And so it's amazing.
But it is
Um,
true, Shannon, because I've done some research for my own patient and all that, that there's a chemical imbalance for narcissistic people where they lack vasopressin in the brain. Is that a direct attribution to someone dealing with narcissistic behavior? So, like if someone has cancer, you cannot accuse them for their sickness or their mood being always angry because they have the illness or the disease. So, do you think that for narcissistic people, that can fall under the same category because they lack a certain hormones in the brain that make them who have that personality?
Good question. And I think it is a combination. I think that, all of those things that they're kind of researching now lead to a predisposition. So it's like anything else. If you have a predisposition for alcoholism or drug abuse, you have a predisposition. And does that excuse you for doing terrible things all your life? No, not at all. It gives you the responsibility to take care of yourself in a way that's different than if you didn't. So it's the same for a narcissist. And if they recognize, and people say, well, there's this percentage of the population, and I say, there's no way anybody can count because they don't show up. The only way we know that a certain percent of the population has depression is because they show up and ask for help.
Correct.
Narcissists don't show up and ask for help. No way.
Raise their hand.
They are dragged into therapy by their partners sometimes, and they don't stick around. So it's extremely rare that people get the help and that they get counted as who they are. So I think it's a genetic predisposition for sure. There are components of that, and parents will often say, yeah, from birth, there was a difference in this kid. But then it's all kinds of other stuff. I think that oftentimes they're extremely indulged by their parents and by society, and they're given a pass, and so they become more and more self-absorbed, more and more believing entitled and believing that they have a right to act out when they don't get what they want. So some people say, well, hurt people hurt people. I don't find that most narcissists are really from a lot of abuse. They're mostly, I think, they come from a highly indulgent parenting style and a highly indulgent culture.
I see. So if let's say you go back to parenting style, if let's say you have helicopter parents that always are on top of you constantly and making sure that you're safe and making sure that every move are being analyzed, does that I mean, is that somewhat of a reason as to why people can become narcissists? I mean, does it revolve around how the parenting style was of their own parents, or is it something that they say, my parents were too tough, I'm going to be more lenient? So how does that go in terms of narcissistic behaviors?
I think a lot of the parents that are overindulgent because their parents were tough. But I think that it isn't, you can be a very loving helicoptery parent to your three kids, and one of them turns narcissistic and the other two just love you to bits and think you're the cat's PJs. And so what matters too, I think, is a lot of times they will have a model. So I oftentimes am actually getting a lot of people, particularly parents, who are seeking me out and saying, my daughter is so narcissistic, or my son is so abusive to me. And typically they'll say, acts just like his father or acts just like her father. So I think there's a modeling that happens as well. But it isn't just helicopter parents. It's more indulgent. It's more the parents who actually kind of worship their kids, and the sun rises and sets on their behind and their toots don't stink. And, it's really like way over the top where everything is poured into them and they don't ever have anything that's hard or frustrating or difficult or challenging. And they literally are emotionally handicapped. They are like toddlers that never got over that tantrum because they never had to. And that's the problem, is that they're in these grown-up bodies and they're still tantruming like they're 3.
Yes. I know some of them actually, Shannon. But then, okay, so if let's say someone succeeds in life, someone does very, very well, and obviously their ego, they have a ego boost and they feel like they own the world. Does that make them necessarily a narcissistic person? Because a lot of people I see, they just directly kind of diagnose people who have a high self-esteem as narcissistic people. So do people do not understand what are the traits of a narcissistic person versus someone who has self-confidence?
Right. And I think it's actually different than that too, because I did a video called The Narcissistic Collapse, and I likened a narcissist to a hot air balloon. So you have to constantly, they're empty inside, they really are. And they have this facade, and they have to constantly be pumped up
Mhm.
by, money or the world or people adoring them, and people praising them and giving them all the attention, and they have to suck all the air out of the room.
Mhm.
Everything has to revolve around them, or again, you get those implosions and explosions. So it's like this hot air balloon. Whereas real self-esteem doesn't come across that way. Real self-esteem is when you feel good enough about yourself that when somebody else needs the air in the room, you just kind of sit back and go, ah, okay. Like you don't have to have all that attention. So that big ego is really an empty lack of self, lack of sense of self.
Okay.
When we actually feel good about ourselves, we don't act that way. We're not boastful. We're not needing that much attention. We don't have to be pumped up all the time because we're holding ourselves together. So it's a lack of internal self awareness and self knowledge and self esteem. But it looks like it comes across as arrogance, and it usually is around very superficial things. So somebody who is that narcissistic arrogance, they're focused on their looks, their status, their money, all of that superficial stuff. Whereas somebody with actual self-esteem has character qualities and values, and they know who they are and what they're about. They're purposeful in their lives. So it's like comparing apples and oranges when people say, well, they just have high self-esteem. I don't see it that way. I think they're empty and superficial, and they're focused on things that are superficial. And that's where they get their sense of ego. But we know that true self-esteem is not that.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. But is it true, Shannon, that a lot of people who are in a relationship with a narcissistic person, what they fear the most is that when they leave the relationship, that narcissistic person refuse to be able to be left out, to be rejected, so they will come back with a fury and attack that person
Yeah.
or diminish their personality or their reputation, and this is what they fear the most. So how can you cut the umbilical cord with a narcissistic person when you feel that this relationship will go nowhere and it's more toxic than anything else?
Yeah. It's really hard. And it is true when someone's been controlling you and training you to control your behaviors to please them, then when you pull the plug, usually you're going to get the sort of the big crescendo.
Correct.
And on a covert, that looks like suicidal depression and tears and flooding and all that. And on the overt, it can be violence and coming after you physically and emotionally and all the stuff in between, with sending in the flying monkeys and making you look crazy and all the gaslighting and da 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 da. So yeah, it is. It's really, really hard. What I like to do is start from, I mean, if there's physical violence, I just want them to get out and we'll sort out the aftermath later. But if they are really even unsure about getting out of the relationship, what I like to do is help a person to develop their internal relationship with themselves,
Mhm.
and then learn to set boundaries. When you talk to me that way, I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Okay.
I'm hanging up now and we can try again later. Or, I'm going to take off now because you're just not really treating me with respect and it's not okay with me anymore, and leaving. So when you do those boundary settings, then that person gets to sit back and say, oh, this isn't how we play this game anymore. This isn't how we do this relationship anymore. And I've actually seen some people who I thought their behavior was so off the rails, they were never coming down from it, who started to behave completely differently and save their marriages. So sometimes it actually works to change behavior. Sometimes it escalates them. And then okay, not only am I leaving, but I'm leaving. So I say boundaries always work. People say boundaries don't work with these people. Boundaries always work because you're learning to stand up for you. You're learning to notice, first of all, what you think, feel, want, and need. And you're learning to stand up for you. And then you get to step back and look and see if they respect my boundaries, cool. We can continue to see how this goes. If they don't, good. I needed that information and now I'm done.
But isn't it common behavior for narcissistic people to not understand what boundaries are? And if they do abide by those boundaries,
Oh, yeah.
know that it's only temporary until they make the other person believe that they follow what the other person says. And then when they fall back in love with them, they're going to go back to their old habits.
More than likely. Yeah. And I think it's always important to let people know that these folks may not change their stripes. So this isn't a one-time thing where you set a boundary and now we're done. We're in love again. But when you learn how to step back and watch and notice that this somebody else's behavior is not about you. And that's a really important piece that people are so enmeshed with this person, they don't understand. So when they learn to step back and watch, when they learn to set reasonable boundaries that any normal person would be able to abide by, then they step back and watch and recognize that tantrum. I tell them to watch the circus go by. As soon as you set a boundary and that person goes crazy, you go, wow, that was pretty wild.
Mhm.
And that was like a 2-year-old tantrum, or they just completely imploded and then exploded and they're all over the map and they're doing this and that. It's not about you. And so when you start to learn to do that, you do that, and you do that with everybody. And I've had people who realized, you know what, that best friend I thought I had, she's a lunatic, and I've been feeding that lunatic for 20 years, and I'm done with that. So I think when you teach somebody that, they take it with them wherever they go.
Mhm.
And I've seen a time when it looked like, oh, okay, he might come around or she might come around, and then they realize over time they're not. This is just another part of the game.
I see.
So yeah, for sure. Change is hard for anybody, even if they're motivated from the inside to change. And so when somebody is motivated by somebody else,
Yeah,
it's really, really hard. And
absolutely.
they have to be very committed to the relationship to really make those changes.
So I'm sure that a lot of listeners are asking the universal question, is there any hope dealing with a narcissistic partner, that there's any possible of positive changes in the long term?
I Yeah, I think it's rare. Again, that one of the lack of empathy has a couple of components to it. They don't recognize or honor or feel like other people's thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs matter like theirs do.
Okay.
And so it's really hard they also blame other people for anything that goes wrong. And when you're constantly flipping the script and turning everything around on someone else and blaming someone else for your own behavior, you can't really change. And so a narcissist is, and again, we're talking from mild to moderate to severe. In the severe range and in the moderate range, no, there's no hope of change. There's no hope that that change is going to stick. You're going to be in a toxic relationship with them. The best thing you can do, if you have to stay in a relationship because you're co-parenting, or it's your parent or your child, you can learn how to stay in that step back place with good boundaries, and you can learn to coexist and take care of yourself within that. Yes, I 100% believe that. And that is unusual. Like a lot of people, especially on YouTube, are like, yeah, cut them off, never speak to your parents again, never speak to your child again, never speak to that person again. I don't believe that you have to do that. I believe we can all learn how to take care of ourselves within a lot of different toxic relationships. But expecting that other person is going to change is not where it's at. It's I'm going to change. And if you honor those changes, cool. If you don't, we're done.
I see. So basically, people have to focus on themselves first to be able to but not expecting, even though you implement some changes on your own to grow in another direction, you should never really expect the other person to follow through. And if that doesn't happen, what is usually the timeline that you should give to yourself to say that there's no hope in this relationship and I should just cut the cord versus saying, okay, there's small, tiny progress, but is that enough to allow someone to stay in a toxic relationship?
Yeah. It's extremely personal because some people are in a 30-year marriage and they really want to see what's going to happen, and they may take a year. Other people might be in a newly dating situation, and I'm going to encourage them to get done sooner, because the longer you stay, the more attached you are, and the more difficult it is to get out. And these little microaggressions create a trauma bond, so that over time you're training yourself to keep trying, keep trying, keep trying, and that's not healthy for you. And also people, may be dealing with a son or a daughter, and they may have grandchildren. So there are different levels of investment that a person has. But in general, I think you have to continually take care of yourself, continually grow in your own healing, calm down your own emotional reactivity, so that you are not in that constant fight or flight stress reaction place, because that's very toxic to an individual.
So if before we conclude this podcast, Shannon, can you give like a couple of tips to the people who are listening to this podcast who are either dealing with someone who's narcissistic or who gets into a relationship with someone like that? What should they expect? I mean, what can they go with in it to say, no, I'm going to change that person because I'm strong enough to change them, or can they say, you know what, let's cut the cord before getting into something too serious? But if someone is already in a 20-year marriage, there's not really anything they can do at this point unless if they go and get divorced. But is there anything that you could give them as a quick tip that they could implement immediately?
Really looking at your relationship with yourself. Notice your own thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs. Notice how you're undermining yourself when you placate others or when you people please. And when you take ownership of yourself and your own thoughts, feelings, wants, and needs, how does that other person react? If you're newly dating and they don't react well, you've got to get out soon, because they're on their best behavior in the beginning.
Exactly.
So that's as good as it gets. So don't think that you're going to change them. That's an absolute fool's errand. Been there, done that. I can promise you it does not work. So cut the cord. And even if you're going to stay married, you can take care of yourself differently. You can have boundaries and uphold your boundaries. Even if you're going to stay in relationship with anybody who's toxic, you can do it more mindfully and more healthily,
Mhm.
and take good care of yourself. And then at some point you may say, you know what, this isn't going to work.
Beautiful, beautiful. And can you tell people as well, how can they find you on YouTube and other channels?
Therapist Talks Thrive Beyond Narcissism is my YouTube channel.
Okay.
And healfromtoxicrelationships.com is another place to find out more information on my coaching program. My book is on Amazon and Kindle, and it's Out of the Fog into the Clear, journaling to help you heal from toxic relationships. And, if you don't have the money for therapy, which I know a lot of people don't, that really is designed to help you walk through the process of healing from the inside out and really rebuilding your life.
Beautiful. Well, Shannon, that is all the time that we have for today's podcast. And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. And thank you again for participating and inspiring our many listeners with your incredible knowledge of toxic relationships. Now, we hope that you all enjoyed today's episode. I'm also very excited about the many upcoming guests that we have scheduled for season 24 of the Happiness Journey podcast, filled with inspirational stories just like the one that you listed today. Now, here are some concluding words of wisdom. To all the survivors of toxic and narcissistic marriages, your courage is a testament to your strength and resilience. Walking away from what once held you captive takes immense bravery, and in doing so, you've reclaimed your power and self-worth. The road may have been hard, but each step that you've been taking is a victory over fear and manipulation. You chose yourself, your peace, and a future of possibility. Healing is a journey, and you are living proof that freedom and happiness are worth fighting for. Your strength in living inspires others to find their own. Now keep rising, and just like a famous singer, Sia, you are unstoppable. My name is Dr. Dan Amzalag, and you may all keep pursuing your amazing journey in life.